Hi, Internet friends. Is history about to repeat itself? Institutional horrors? For centuries, the White Plague, also known as tuberculosis, TB, or consumption, was considered an ailment of the poor. The rich often escaped the embarrassment of the disease by retreating to Europe health spas, while the poor continued to suffer with no relief, as the Industrial Revolution brought more workers into crowded urban centers, the plague spread, and no one was immune. State and local anti-tuberculosis organizations led a social movement to improve sanitary conditions through anti-spitting laws and health regulations, encouraged consumptives to seek medical treatment, and persuaded states and local governments to create a network of state and county hospitals that isolated tuberculosis patients. These sanitariums marked the beginning of government-funded campaigns to address tuberculosis. At these sites, consumptives spent years seeking a cure through prescribed regimes of fresh air and sunlight. Located away from local urban populations, these self-sufficient medical complexes became isolated communities. The first funded sanitariums were large institutions that borrowed design elements from previously developed government institutions, such as Kirkbride asylums. Popular architectural styles, familiar and soothing, characterized the exterior of these buildings, while the interior had plain decorating that was easy to clean and prevent contagious bacille and dust from collecting. Although professionalism often means a striving for excellence, American professionalism has too frequently met an association with a stubborn failure to acknowledge the limitations of ignorance. In medicine in particular, there's too much history of unwillingness to admit that a science in its infancy can be a danger to patients. A good illustration is the story of how psychiatric became obsessed with infections as a likely cause of madness. In the early 20th century, tuberculosis was rampant and existed in every hospital for the mentally ill in America. Sometimes it's easier to just forget the embarrassment of how people with a sickness were treated. As a saying goes, if we don't talk about it, then it didn't happen. But this couldn't be further from the truth. TB patients were not treated well. The experimental science behind curing TB is vastly different than looking for a cure for COVID-19, isn't it? Well, we hope so, right? I guess as many that are getting sick from COVID-19, will we hear in the future of the experimental science to try and find a cure for this disease? Don't be so quick to assume we have more civilized way of treatment. Because as hospitals become overcrowded with patients of COVID-19 and staff is overworked and supplies and staff are limited, remember from history how patients were treated to get a picture of what could possibly be in our future. In the 19th century, to have TB carried a stigma. With this stigma came people being left in insane asylums to hope they got a cure, but family knew once in the asylum, the chance of leaving was a very low percent. Efforts to treat tuberculosis or consumption over the millennia have been largely tales of tragedy and frustration. A variety of herbal concoctions, dietary interventions, and climatic prescriptions were among the more benign remedies offered. A description of medical treatment for consumption was a huge commercial system of quackery and poison. Another experimental way to cure the tuberculosis, surgeons exposed the lungs to light and would remove ribs to help the patient breathe. Most patients had a lack of care. Their treatment was sunlight and air. With no real way to cure tuberculosis, doctors did what they could to treat the illness. Doctors devised treatments such as inserting balloons into patients' lungs and filling them with air to help them breathe. Doctors also removed ribs and muscle tissue to alleviate pressure and create more room for the damaged lungs. This resulted in painful, ineffective, and often fatal surgeries. Pneumothorax was also a surgery that was done on consumption patients. Pneumothorax is a surgical treatment to collapse the lung by inserting air or nitrogen into the pleural space. Athens Lunatic Asylum, built in 1874, was originally intended for tending to just tuberculosis patients. But as we know with history, Athens Lunatic Asylum housed patients far over its capacity for most of its functioning years. This overcrowding caused the care for each patient to decrease until the hospital began abusing its patients. Along with tuberculosis, mental illness was seen to be a part of it. As we know with history, mental illness was seen as an embarrassment for families, and the individuals were treated barbaric. Numerous experiments performed on human test subjects in the United States that have been considered unethical and were often performed illegally without the knowledge or consent of the patient or the families. Such tests have occurred throughout American history. These experiments included the exposure of humans to many chemicals and biological weapons, including infections with deadly or debilitating diseases, human radiation experiments, injection of toxic and radioactive chemicals, surgical experiments, interrogation and torture experiments, tests involving mind-altering substances, and wide variety of others. You may ask, well, who funded these experiments? Well, friends, none other than our great government. The human research programs were usually highly secretive, and in many cases, information about them were not released until many years after the studies, of course, had been performed. Tuberculosis was considered as a disease of the poor because they were the most affected population in society. It was a disease with a definitive social stigma attached to it. Sufferers and the families were considered dirty and diseased. A couple of experiences from a lady who journaled while inside an insane asylum. 2 ladies of the ward came in with combs in their hands. We were told, sit down on the bench, and the hair of 45 women was combed with 1 patient, 2 nurses, and 6 combs. As I saw some of the sore heads combed, I thought this was another dose I had not bargained for. One lady asked one of the women of the ward if she could rub more gently, and the lady from the ward said, there isn't much fear of hurting you. Shut up, or you'll get it worse. Bath time was of nightmares. 45 women using the same washcloth, dipped in ice-cold, freezing water. By this time, another lady had been undressed, and as much as I hated my recent bath, I would have taken another, if by it I could have saved her the experience. Imagine plunging a sick girl into a cold bath when it made me, who had never been ill, shake as if I couldn't see straight. I heard her explain to the ward lady that her head was still sore from her illness. The 2 ward ladies didn't care. The more you complained, the harder they hurt you. To try and sleep in the institution was a joke. The ward ladies would walk up and down all night long with keys jangling. The experiences of real life people inside of the insane asylums are of nightmares and something I fear to happen again. The horrors of inside the insane asylums were real life for some. Let's hope we don't repeat ourselves. Many patients arrived with burning lungs and fading hopes, only to endure their final days in pain and loneliness, and sometimes madness. They left this world through a secret tunnel, many forever forgotten. Many sanitariums had something called a death chute, which was a body chute, a 500-foot tunnel that runs nearly straight down from the sanatorium's main entrance to the railroad tracks. Motorized cables lowered the corpses of TB victims to trains bound for the cemetery or crematorium. Nobody knows how many people made their final journey through the tunnels. It is existence hidden from other patients to keep them from panicking. To think that this treatment would never or could never be done again would be naive, friends.